the big question is how much this is actually a step forward and just sort of a play for time from Russia. I mean, as you noted there, looks like there is progress here. We will have a promise from both sides on a potential ceasefire in the Black Sea that would allow shipping to go through the Black Sea. This is aimed at allowing Russia to have better access to the global market for agricultural products and fertilizer. Obviously grows a lot of wheat, a huge supplier of fertilizer for Europe and elsewhere. But then there's that big caveat there at the bottom where Russia says, listen, if you want us to do this, you have to lift all these sanctions. Agriculture has been a very heavily sanctioned sector for Russia. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, of course, if anybody's going to want to do business with these Russian companies, they're going to need to lift sanctions. But on the other hand, it's sort of what you'd think of as like a chipping away at the sanctions regime on Russia, and that's going to be seen as a major concession to Vladimir Putin.
Well, so what is Russia getting out of this, Nick, if this does actually come to bear?
Well, obviously, for one thing, they'd be getting money, so access to global markets for fertilizer, agricultural products, which would be a pretty big deal. But then I think the bigger issue is what Vladimir Putin really wants is a sort of reintegration into the global economy, into global financial networks, but also reintegration into what is considered acceptable and polite society, if you will. I mean, for so long since the Ukraine war, and even dating to before that, there was really a sense that Russia had been banished for all of its acts of aggression over Crimea, over Georgia, over Ukraine earlier, and then the latest, the full-scale invasion, that people didn't really want to interact with Russia, that they wanted that they were not fit to be integrated. They got expelled from the Group of Eight, which then became the G7. So this is, I think, what you're seeing is Russia hopes this is one small step toward reintegration into financial circles with potentially and hopefully for President Vladimir Putin for more to come.
Got to say, Nick, I'm a list maker. When I've got to get something done, sounds like there's still a lot on this list to getting peace and a full ceasefire.
There is hope, obviously, by some Trump administration's officials that you could see a ceasefire relatively quickly. But, there are so many details to be worked out. So you had a temporary ceasefire for 30 days, the proposal not to hit energy infrastructure, but we haven't really seen any detailed conversations about getting that done. If you have a full ceasefire, there are all sorts of questions there. Russia says they don't want weapons to flow to Ukraine. You'd have to figure out how you monitor that ceasefire. Do you bring in peacekeepers? This is all stuff that would take very detailed technical negotiations. So far, there's no real indication that either side is ready to commit to that kind of agreement, which would really require massive concessions. I mean, I should say Ukraine has said, listen, we are ready for a full ceasefire. Just halt the fighting. It's very simple. Big question there is how do you monitor it? And then what happens if someone violates the ceasefire? What then?
All right. Speaking of negotiations, I want to get to one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg about some senior executives, both at tech companies and some foreign companies, who are asking the Trump administration when it comes to the U.S.'s strategy in global semiconductors, especially as they relate to AI. What's going on? Who's been in D.C. or calling the White House? What do they want?
Well, the big question here is you have these extremely advanced NVIDIA chips that really are the super important, crucial for AI, that you can't build these massive AI models without the chips to fuel them. And those chips really do depend on NVIDIA. But the U.S. has imposed very stringent export restrictions on who should be allowed to get those chips, what responsibility they would have, what the security concerns are around that. So you've seen a real pressure campaign, a lot of lobbying from the Trump administration to the Trump administration, saying basically, hey, you guys say you want to spur business, you want to spur investment, you want to cut regulation, give us access to these chips that President Joe Biden put really severe restrictions on right as he was leaving office. And the big country that's doing that is the United Arab Emirates. Their national security advisor was here last week, making a really strong push, saying we're ready to invest $1.4 trillion in the U.S. economy, but you got to give us those chips.
But it raises the question, Nick, how do you make sure that the U.S. stays ahead when it comes to this technology if these chips are able to flow unrestricted to the rest of the world?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think there's anyone talking about totally just all bets are off, unrestricted access to these chips, but it is a big concern. And one of the things the administration has done is said, listen, we won't give you these most super duper high end chips, but we will give you these other chips that are pretty darn good, but they're not quite as high end. And that's all part of this strategy to keep China several years behind, particularly that's really aimed at China, given that China has the resources and the wherewithal to really invest a lot of research and time in these chips. But, you know, right now we've seen China making a lot of gains themselves, and there are a lot of questions around this U.S. strategy. Would it work at all? Can the U.S. stay ahead for so long? And is it a realistic strategy not only to say, okay, when we run the race, we're going to stay ahead of you, but we're also going to kneecap the other guy as we go along? And there are a lot of people who really disagree with that sort of an approach.